Yes, hello again. Long time no see, as it is called. It is quite a long time since our last session, our last coaching video, but I have had a lot of questions in the recent weeks about several of the configuration options for the race assistance, and I decided to run a session about all the meanings of the settings and configuration options for the race assistance. And today we will have a kind of a different format. I like to welcome Peter Kasbergen, one of my patrons and also a long-time supporter of the project and the software. And he will take the role of an interviewer for today and will guide me with his own questions about all the settings through the session so that you get the best user perspective as possible. Okay, Peter, I think we can go.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Oliver. Happy to help. We all know that it's quite a complex piece of software that you've created, and therefore there are always questions, and I'd like to go through the main ones I have had in the past and maybe still have. First, I would like to ask you about just the basic configuration for the different assistants. There are a couple of assistants, and they all have their own settings.
Yeah.
Maybe you could show something of that.
Yes, for sure. As you can see here, this is the main launchpad of the software. You have two pieces of where you can configure the simulator controller. The most easy one, as we have seen in a different coaching session, is simulator setup, and the low-level configuration application is this one. In terms of configuring the race assistance, they are identical, and I will use for now this one because it's smaller and easier to access. But the options you find here, you will also have in the wizard, in the configuration wizard. So let's start simulator configuration. And okay, here it is. And you will find the configuration of the race assistance in these three tabs, Race Engineer, Race Strategist, and Race Spotter. And if we go to one of these tabs, you can define several low-level configurations which will, at least according to my assumption, stay the same for all the time you will use the software. So it's not a setting you will have to dial for each and every race, but you will configure it once and forget it. You can choose the settings, the configuration settings below for each simulator. For example, if you go here to Assetto Corsa Competizione, which means all the settings you see here apply to Assetto Corsa Competizione, so you can have different settings. As you can see here, it switches for each of the simulator. If you want to have all simulators equal, which is not perfect, I will mention, or I will come to that a little bit later, but it's possible. You can use this button to synchronize all settings to all simulators as a kind of a convenience shortcut. Okay, let's go here through the low-level configurations. First, you can decide where you get your race settings in general from when you're starting a session in your simulator. The race settings, and I must make a little jump here, are all the things you have to dial for a given session, like your target pressures, the pit stop rules, and stuff like that. Normally, you can use this application, we will open it soon, to dial all the settings, but there are different methods to handle it more conveniently. And this drop-down menu allows you to choose which way the software uses to acquire the settings for the session. The first one simply uses the settings which you have set using this application. This is the easy way, but it's also the not such a convenient way, because you have to take a look at the race settings all the time when you start a session, and maybe you have to change a couple of them for the upcoming session. There is a different method here, load from database. We have a second tool to manage settings. This is the so-called session database, and I will open it now. And I will also open the race settings here. And the session database allows you to also manage settings here in this list, but you can manage them specific for a given car and a given track and so on. And you can also manage settings for all cars and all tracks, so you have some kind of specificity to define a setting. I will come to that later on, but that's the meaning of the load from database. The method which is applied here is load as many settings as possible from the session database, and all the rest, which is not available here, from the simple race settings dialog, which is also and only used if you have chosen this option. Peter, if something is not clear, please jump in and ask even deeper.
I was having questions, but you have answered them already. So
Okay,
please go on.
Great. So the next option lets you specify what you will do with the settings at the end of a session. You can ask, you can choose ask, which means that the race assistant will ask you if you want to store the settings. You can always save, or you can say no action, which means the stuff the simulator controller has learned about a couple of these settings will be discarded. What will be saved? Yes, most and foremost the fuel consumption and the average lap time for the given track and the given weather condition. You can see this later on if you save them here in the session database. For example, let's take my beloved McLaren and a given track, for example, Spa-Francorchamps, and dry weather. Okay, the system has learned that a typical lap time will be 2 minutes 21 seconds and 4 or 5 liters of fuel consumption here. Let's take a look if we have something for light rain. Yes, and so on. So the simulator controller stores the knowledge which is not bound to the current session, which is more like general knowledge, to the session database when you have chosen always save, or when you have chosen ask and answered the questions of the assistant with yes. So, very important are the tire pressures. For the race engineer, the tire pressures in this case means the chosen cold tire pressures for your car setup at the point in time when you enter the grid. Well, the tire pressures you have dialed in your setup, to say it this way. And there are a couple of methods to do this. You can load them from the settings, which means it will take this values here in dry conditions or this values here in wet conditions. Which also means that you have to enter them into the race settings shortly before the race. When you have dialed your setup and you're standing in the starting grid, you will have to update these values and accept the dialog with OK, so that simulator controller, or to be precise, the race engineer knows about the cold tire pressures and is able to compute tire pressures for the next pit stop as precise as possible. Not the most convenient way to always enter it, but for some of the simulators, no other way might be available. The second method here is load them from database. It is a convenient option, but not very precise. It means at the beginning of the session, the race engineer will take the ambient temperatures and look up past pressures you have used or the race engineer has derived for the given track and the given car and the given ambient conditions. Let's take a look here. For example, we have, okay, let's take this one. We have data for it, drizzle with wet tires, 24. Maybe it was for dry tires, no? Ah, okay. As you can see, there are not always available any data for this, because these are all recorded data from your past sessions. So this method is not very, I am using it not at all, but it's available and maybe of some help, but I would like to recommend this one, import from simulator, which is unfortunately only available for R-Factor 2 and Assetto Corsa Competizione. It means load the pressure setup from the setup you have chosen for your car before you have entered the grid, and load the data directly from the simulator. One point to mention here, this works for Assetto Corsa Competizione only if you have copied the setup pressures to the fuel and strategy tab, to the first page of the strategy using the use current pressures button, because only from there the data can be acquired using the external API. But this is the most precise method, since you will get the exact code pressures as you have them dialed in the setup. And the last method, which will be published next Friday, is this one. Use initial pressures, which means the following. In the exact moment the data connection between simulator controller and the simulator is established, the race engineer will look up the current tire pressures and will use them as the base code pressures for all its calculations. It is at least potentially not as precise as import from simulator, because you have been sitting at the grid for some time and the tires get cold and the pressure decreased and so on. But it is a good option, for example, for simulators which does not provide a direct data connection. Okay, and also here at session end, the race engineer might ask you to store its knowledge about the cold pressures of this session, the derived cold pressures of this session, which means you will create more and more data here at the tire pressures repository. You can choose ask, The typical answer question will be: have you been satisfied with the car? Should we note the setup? And when you say yes, the data will be transferred to the database. You can always save them. This is a method I'm not using because sometimes you only have run 2 to 3 laps and the tires did not get up to temperature while testing, and you will end up with a lot of garbage data here. So I have always chosen ask here. And yes, for sure, you can also ignore all the data, which will leave this area of the session database empty in the end. Okay, so these are the most important ones because this will, let's say, define how good the race engineer is in supporting you at the pit stop.
Oh,
Yes?
one question.
Yeah.
If you have during the race set the tire pressures or done a pit stop with tire pressures and that in the end turned out not to be quite correct,
Yeah.
and you still do save at the session end the tire pressures, does that mean that that is then put into the database as a reference, as a correct reference, as a, say, a light green boxes,
Uh,
or something else happen?
yes, something else happens because when you end up with pressures which are too high or too low, the engineer will compensate for that. He will calculate a corrected cold pressure, and this corrected cold pressure will end up here, not the hot pressure value.
Okay, very nice.
These are always the cold pressures for the start of the race. Let's take it here, dry. As you can see, no? They are quite low. So these are not the hot pressures.
No, but you could have chosen incorrect cold pressures.
Yes.
That made
Okay.
you end up with too hot or too cold, or well, not hot cold, but too high pressures or too low in the end. Or
Yeah, but okay, that's is possible. If you have wrong data in the input, you will have wrong in the output. If this happens to you, or if you suspect that the pressure data you see here is not correct, you can open the database files. These are text files which you can edit with Notepad++, for example. So you can delete those data. And I'm also have in the backlog a tool where you can do this graphically.
okay, looking forward to that.
Yeah, I know. I understand. So, okay, come back to here. The data analyst box below, let's configure the learning phase each assistant used before its service is available to you. Value I use here are 2 laps after the start of the race or a pit stop where the engineers gather data until all these data has stabilized and it is safe to calculate new values from them. And you also can here, using the statistical window, decide how many laps from the past will be included in all calculations according to the damping factor, which means the most recent lap will be included with full weight. The lap before that will be, will have a 20% less influence, and so on. Okay, that's for the race engineer. The race strategist is more simple. You have also the data analyst area, and you can decide whether you want to have a race report at the end of your session, which will be stored in the reports folder always, or also you can be asked by the strategist if you want them. whether you want to save the telemetry data. Telemetry data is all the knowledge about the session from lap times, tire wear, brake wear, and everything, which then can be used in the strategy workbench to run strategy simulations and stuff like that. There's a different coaching video about that. I won't go any deeper for the moment here, but here you also can declare to always save them, to be asked, and to not save them at all. And finally, you can declare here whether you want to be criticized by the strategies at the end of the session. Um, it's more or less the same information you can find in the race report, but it will be verbalized by the strategies, so you will get a spoken review of your race here. And the spotter, very similar, also the statistical settings, and here you can choose all the different announcement warnings and alerts the spotter again can give to you. You can switch them on and off individually. You can declare or decide how many or how often you will get informations about your opponent, and so on and so on. So, long story. Sorry for that, Peter, but these are the low-level configuration you typically set once and forget.
No, I think that was very clear. Yeah, and the simulator configuration provides a nice focused interface for that. So all clear.
But just to mention it again, if you still use simulator setup for your configuration task, change all the settings there, because the low-level tool will override the configuration generated by a simulator setup. So stick as long as possible to the wizard, because it's much easier to use. I have only used this one here because it's such a nice and clean window, and yeah.
Yeah, no, that's clear, and thanks for the warning. I guess that's a good thing to note. All right, was that all you wanted to say about this topic?
Yes.
All right, okay. Then let's move on to some other questions I have, and that is the next one is, could you elaborate a little bit more about? We know that the race engineer can help with fuel calculation, how much fuel to take, how much, during the race, how much fuel to refuel during a pit stop.
Yeah.
Can you tell a little bit more about how all that is calculated? Because there are a lot of, I think, different locations where you can enter stuff, and yeah.
Yeah, in the end, the race engineer observes your fuel consumption and your fuel level and the remaining session time. That's the input values the engineer have, and it will yes call you to the pit if it sees that you are running low on fuel. But you can also initiate a pit stop on your own by calling the engineer and ask for planning a pit stop, or the pit stop can be initiated by the strategist when you're running a pre-selected strategy, and so on. So there are many ways which initiate a pit stop planning. But once you have started with the pit stop planning, the engineer takes a look at your fuel consumption, the remaining session time, and the fuel level that is left in the car. But there are, as you said, a number of screws you can turn to influence the amount of fuel the engineer will recommend for the next pit stop. First, you can choose here whether your current session will have a formation lap and a post-race lap. And you can choose here, here, how many safety fuel you always want to have left because, for example, at the end of a timed race, there might be an extra lap because the leading car just crossed the start-finish line shortly behind you, and you have to drive another additional lap, and then the in lap as well, or the post-race lap. So it's good to have some reserve, and you can dial this one here. And using this information, the race engineer will try to, yeah, get the best estimate how much fuel have to be refueled at the next pit stop, so that you will either will run another full stint, or you will reach the end of the session. So, for example, if you will have a splash and dash strategy in some sprint races, this is a good option, and you will be called to the pit 5 laps before the end. The race engineer will know that you only have to refill, let's say, 20 liters to reach the finish line. As I mentioned before, you can dial this settings using this race settings application shortly before the session. But as you imagine, a couple of them are standard and have always the same value. And as I said here, you have the opportunity to set these values here in a session database, so that you never have to touch them again. So if you always use 4 liters for your safety fuel, set them for all cars on all tracks in all weather conditions for this simulator, and use the load database method for the loading of the settings as session begin, and you're fine. Let me take a short look if I have forgot something. Yes, this might be interesting as well. If you, for example, running a stint race and totally rely on the engineer, you can set here the number of laps the engineer will warn you before you run out of fuel. So this means you will have 2 laps time left for planning and preparing the pit stop together with the engineer. On some short tracks, it might be, for example, better to set this to 3 laps. So yes, here again, you can select a track here, for example, Brands Hatch. And let's say, where it is. So many options, sorry. It means pit stop warning. Sorry, I don't find it at the moment, but I know it's there. So, okay, you can set, for example, for Brands Hatch, this value here for to 3 laps, and you will be fine. Sorry, it's a long list, and I don't want to waste time to reach each and every line to find it now. Okay, let's delete this one. Okay, I think that's more or less all to say about fuel calculation for the race engineer.
Okay, thank you. I noticed something on the, I think it was the strategy tab. If you could go to the strategy tab in the race settings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because this data is now either here or in the session database set to, I think, what are the defaults for ACC.
Yes.
But I know that this may be different in other simulators.
Yes, right.
So
It's
that can be set then in the session database, right?
yes, right. You have either dial it for each and every session, which will be, yeah, at least disturbing some with the time. So you want to dial it for each and every simulators. For example, you select Automobilista 2 and set different values here. Maybe even
Right.
for different cars and series, you will have different values.
Yes. Okay. And then it's basically up to yourself to determine, for instance, the refuel rate and so on.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay. Clear? That's clear. Um, I think that's clear how the fuel is calculated. Um, let's move on to the next question, which is about tires and tire pressures. We
Ah,
already talked a little bit about it.
sorry, Peter.
Cool.
Just to make it complete, here it is.
Okay.
Pit stop, low fuel warning, 3 laps.
There we are. Yep. We found it. All right.
Okay.
Yes, as I was saying, tire pressures. We know that the race engineer can help during the race with tire pressures. We already saw a little bit about tire pressures that are going into the database and that you can get from there. But can you elaborate a little bit more on how things are calculated left and right?
Yes, and to say it upfront, this is the most complex and most versatile area of the race engineer, as you have so many options and you have the race engineer has so many ways to calculate it, so it needs a little bit of experience to get it right. I will do my best now to explain the concepts.
Yeah, just to note, from my own experience at least, I think ACC is the sim where this matters the most.
Yes, right. There are even sims where you don't have any possibility to set tire pressures, but in ACC it's really, really, really good in terms of simulation. It's very sensitive, as you said. And so if you want to use the race engineer here, you have to set the settings as correct as possible, so you will have the best possible tire pressures in the end you can get. It's worth it. Especially in endurance races where the conditions are changing all the time. It's not so important for a half-hour sprint race where you don't change tires. Okay, but in endurance races where rain comes in, it's so important to get the tire pressures right. It will have a great impact on lap times. Okay, so let's start. As I said before, you have to inform the race engineer about the setup tire pressures when you start the session. You can do it either by input the values here, or you can import them from the simulator or use the initial pressures, something like that. When it now comes to pit stop, the race engineer will try to guess the best cold tire pressures, once again, according to its knowledge from the past laps. It will take a look at the hot pressures you had during those laps and will try to incorporate a correction factor on top of the known cold pressures to get the cold pressures or the setup pressures for the next pit stop.
Sorry to interrupt
Yeah.
already.
Yep.
I don't know if you're going to get to this, but I think it's important to know how the hot pressures are calculated, because there are several ways to do it. For instance, if you use other tools, they might calculate an average. Maybe you take it on the start-finish line, or
Yeah. So a very good question. I think I will have forgot that. Yes, the pressures by the race engineer are always taken shortly after crossing the start-finish line. So whenever you dial your ideal pressures, you must use this reference point. It's something around 5 seconds after you have crossed the start-finish line, because that is the trigger for the race engineer to update all the internal data. Yes, there are tracks, and I will come to that, where using this point for the ideal pressures will not be the best one, because you will, for example, have a very long straight where the tires get cold. I will have an example with Paul Ricard in a few moments where you can see what you can do in this case. The hot pressures. The engineer must know about the ideal hot pressures. And this, as I said, no, you enter your initial pressures here on this page. And on this page about the pit stop, you will set the ideal hot pressures for this given session, again, with a reference point of a couple of seconds after the start-finish line. And as always, you can set it here as well for all cars and all tracks, so you don't have to dial it here. And you don't have to enter different values if you switch simulator, for example. It's very, very convenient to use the session database to manage all the settings.
What happens if you enter both differently?
It depends on the method you have chosen here. If you have chosen load from database, this one will override this one.
Okay.
Okay, so the engineer always tries to calculate the setup pressure for the next pit stop for the cold tires, so that you will reach this hot pressures after a few laps. When the ambient conditions stay the same, this calculation will most likely be spot on when the input data was correct, with one exception. We will take a look in a few minutes. For example, when you had a pressure loss because going over curbs, or had an off track. But I will go a little bit deeper into this topic in a few minutes. But when the environmental conditions, which means air temperature, track temperature, rain level, and stuff like that, stay the same, the mathematics behind getting to the ideal cold pressures are quite simple. So they will be spot on. An important field here is the so-called deviation threshold, which means that the race engineer will only apply a correction factor when your hot pressures deviate from these target hot pressures by at least this value. So for example, if you're running 27.7, it will use the same pressures which has been set here, or which has been used at the last pit stop for the next pit stop as well. So now let's come to the funny part. The environmental conditions change. For example, you are running an endurance race, and you are going into the evening sessions. The temperatures are dropping. The sun disappears, and there are a lot of additional temperature effects on your tires, and the pressures get low. Besides correcting the cold pressures for the next stint, which in the evening hours typically mean using a higher cold pressure for the setup, the engineer is also able to create a kind of temperature trend from the past and project it into the future. So if during the last hour you have constantly dropping temperatures, the engineer assumes that this will proceed for the next stint as well, and it will try to create tire pressures which are ideal on average for the next stint. So there might be a little bit too high for an evening stint at the beginning, and they will be spot on for most part of the stint and maybe a little bit too low for the end. When using this correction factor, you can enable this or disable this according to your liking. Another interesting topic is when you have a really radical weather change. As we have seen here before, you have two different start pressures, the ones for the dry tires and the ones for the wet or intermediate tires. Depending on the conditions at the start, the engineer will use either with this one or this one. In dry situations, it will use the dry tire setup, and it will remember the values you have taken here for the case when the weather changes and you have to mount wet tires in this example, and it will use this pressures in this situation because it has no knowledge about pressures for wet tires for this session at all, so it will use this as its starting point. Once you
Just a
have,
question,
yeah, yeah,
sorry.
yeah, yeah.
Does it also remember the associated ambient and track temperatures at that point?
No. So you have to predict it a little bit. For example, if you start in dry conditions in 20 degrees ambient temperature and you see that rain will come in, a typical effect, at least in the Setta Corsa Competizione, is that the temperatures drop as well to, let's say, 16 degrees. So you will have to enter wet tire pressures for these conditions here. The problem with wet conditions is there are so broad in terms of water level at the track and temperature effects, so it's always a rough guess. But your wet tires also have a broad area of more or less good pressures ranging from 29.5 to 30.5 for wet tires, so it might be okay. But there is a different, there is help indeed. For example, you have a different correction factor based on database values, which means the following. Whenever the race engineer encounters a situation which it has not seen before in the current session, it can consult, when this option is checked, all the data you have in your database for the given car and track, and let's say for a given environmental conditions. So when rain comes in and the system sees, the engineer sees, okay, it's light rain and we have 24 degrees air temperature, or let's say we have 22, it will take a look in the session database and will use these pressures also, I emphasize also, when deriving the tire pressures for your pit stop when swapping to wet tires. Also means it will also kind of incorporating these values, will take also these values, will try to mix them to get up to a compromise because neither might be correct. And maybe you will end up with some decent good pressures for this situation. This is this correction option. I will check it only for races where you have changing conditions, where changing conditions are ahead. And you can also set this here in the session database. So for example, you enable this setting only for, yeah, let's say the rain conditions. Okay, that is this one. The last one here is that you can also apply a correction factor based on pressure loss, but this is a two-side coin or two-side sword, because you can also end up with very bad pressures when when the pressures loss was not a loss of pressure because of running over curbs or having an off track, but only because the beginning pressures was bad or were bad. What's happening here? Yeah, the engineer detects a loss of pressure in one or more tires in yeah, in correlation to the other tires. And when it comes to a pit stop, it will subtract this pressure loss from the target pressure, because yeah, you have lost pressure. The typical calculation of the low pressure will end up with a too high cold pressure value. So you have to subtract the pressure you have lost, which means you may end up with an even lower pressure if it was not a pressure loss at all. So I haven't checked this one, but I listened to the race engineer. It will tell me that I might have had a pressure loss, and will try to compensate for that on my own if I know it was real pressure loss. Okay, this is this one. The last thing I want to mention, and I promised this before, is to handle special cases for the target pressures, for the hot target pressures. For example, the most important corner at Paul Ricard is the right hand at the end of the long straight. So you want to have the perfect hot pressures in this specific corner. On the other hand, when you have run the long straight, your tires got cold quite a bit, and you will end up with too low pressures for this corner if you use this one here as the target pressures at the start-finish line. Rescue is near. Let's take a look here at Paul Ricard. Where is it? Here. For all cars in dry conditions. Once again, Paul Ricard. Okay, I have set it for all. That's an error. I have had to set it for dry conditions, but okay, I must move this one. But the story is here. You can set for Paul Ricard a different target pressure for the start-finish line, which means that you will end up at the end of the long straight with the ideal 27.6. As I said, whether all is wrong, you have to set it for dry pressures, and for wet conditions you have to set a different target pressure. This is my fault, but this is the way how to do it. Okay? Peter?
Yes, clear. Yeah, definitely. So you take note of the pressure at the end of the straight and then correct for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Uh,
Clear.
One last point to mention. Sorry, I saw it. The race engineer has also several possible methods for deciding when it is time to change the compound. The most obvious one, it is weather related. Let's take a look at the documentation. You can find in the wiki here a chapter about tire compounds. Too far. Here it is. And there are some rules where when tire compound category might be suitable for given weather conditions. So this decision method might be the best fit for most cases, but there are two others available. For example, when you expect a race with, let's say only drizzle conditions, which is quite often in some endurance leagues. So you won't have heavy rain. There is, let's say a border between running dry tires in drizzle conditions on a greasy track and running wet tires for the same conditions. And the border might be dependent on the tire temperature. For example, if your dry tires get too cold, the engineer will decide to switch to wet tires, or the other way around. When your wet tires get too hot, you can switch to dry tires. And there is let's say, a typical tire temperature where the tire will not work anymore, and you can set it this way. And the obvious one is never change compound, which I know I don't use never. I don't use ever, but it's there. Okay, I think now I have told really everything about tire pressures, tire compounds, and the race engineer.
Yes, all clear, I think. Yeah, and then we come to another setting that we've already had in the display, is that the assistants can also help with repairing stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's also some logic behind that, I guess.
Yes, that's right. The engineer detects damages on your car. Not in all sims, but in most of them. And it will tell you that you had just collected some damage, and that it will try to analyze your lap times and the driving behavior of the car, and will come up with a recommendation about whether it is beneficial to conduct a repair pit stop, an unplanned pit stop. And you have some options to choose from when repairing should take place. And let's take a look at this one. There are three different repair options. Not everyone is available in every sim, but you can repair your suspension, your chassis and so on, and you repair your bodywork and aerodynamic elements, and you can also repair your engine. For each of these repair type, you can choose whether the engineer will try to recommend a pit stop for repair when you have collected this kind of damage. My experience shows that repairing suspension damage is almost without any alternative. So I use always here. Repairing aerodynamics and the bodywork, it depends. It depends on the remaining session length. It depends on the lap time degradation you have. And I have set it to an impact of about 1 second on my lap time. So the race engineer knows about your lap time before the incident and will compare it to a few laps after the incident. This number of laps the engineer have to look at your lap times can be set here in the basic configuration. And you can also define some threshold values. The level of damage are Yes, numbers which are unfortunately different for each and every simulator, so you have to experiment which kind of damage threshold you want to have. But to be honest, this is not a very good method, since a damage on the side of the car, even if it has a high value, does not have any great impact on lap times, for at least in Assetto Corsa Competizione, whereas you can have a small damage on the diffuser and you will have no control over the car at all. So I stick to the impact method and the lap time comparison. So these are the settings you can choose from, and when you then the engineer will might recommend a pit stop, and you will still have the option to decide against it. You can ignore the engineer. It will not blame you for ignoring him or her. So it's only a recommendation.
Okay, that's clear. I was just wondering because you can set an impact here, and if for instance, as you have set it here, the impact is more than 1 second per lap. Does that mean that it will then always ask you to come in, or does it also take into account the how many laps are left in the stint or in the race and the strategy and so on?
Yeah, very good question. Very good question. You're great. Hey, this is the threshold or the decision whether the engineer will recommend a pit stop at all. So if the impact is below 1 second, it will leave it that way. But there is a second calculation, which means will a pit stop will be even worth it in terms of remaining session time and time to repair the car. And this calculation uses some values of the strategy tab. For example, you will have to calculate the pit lane delta, and you will also have to calculate the repairing time, either simultaneously to tire service and refueling. So the engineer tries to estimate whether it will be worth to come in for repair. For example, I had a crash in one of the last league races. Some car hit me from behind before the chicane, 4 laps before the end of the race. The car was toast, totally toast. And I had a degradation of lap times around 8 seconds. But there were only 4 laps left, and the engineer said it's not worth to come in, so try to get to the end using the damage you have.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Clear. One other question. This is what we are looking here is what you can set in the race settings. You can also do this in the session database.
Yes, as well.
Can you show the settings?
Yes. Here you have the value of the drop-down menu. And here you have separately the value which will be entered here in this field when the drop-down value is depending on a value. Clear?
Yes. Clear. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So
Yeah.
I think there are some questions left, but we already have an hour and it's quite a long video, and I know it can be it's very hard to look a video this long. I think we will run this different session for all the strategy stuff together with the race strategies. It's almost worth another half an hour, so we will skip it for today and we'll run another session in a week or two. It's okay for you?
That's totally fine. That's totally fine. I'm looking forward to that one, but no rush.
Okay, then for all of you out there who are looking this video, seeing this video, I hope you get a couple of information. I know, and Peter know as well, this software is so complex, but is so capable at the same time. Stay as simple as possible and as complicated as needed. All the options are there. Use it to your success, as it says. Okay. So
Oliver, thank you.
yeah. Have a nice evening. Okay.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.